Radio. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been helping me get out of debt. Perhaps not surprisingly, I'm pretty comfortable in front of a microphone, and a lot of that stems from my years in college, Emerson College in Boston, where as a film major I dabbled in the other mass communications, and I for a while was a radio DJ, both at the student college radio, WECB, and the much more professional one, WERS. WECB was on the AM radio spectrum, and WERS broadcast on regular FM radio to an audience well over 1 million. I had a lot of fun in both of those, but my experiences were incredibly different. I thought I'd share some of them because they give insight both into how technology worked at the time and also a little bit about how much cataloging means to me. Contrasting WECB, Emerson College Broadcasting, and WERS, Emerson Radio Station, is not incredibly fair. WECB was what people would normally call college radio. It was broadcast, but not quite broadcast. It was actually circuit broadcast, which meant that it went into the electrical systems of a couple dorms, and if you had an AM radio tuned just right, you could listen to whatever was going on there. WERS was, in almost every way, a professional radio station. It was run that way. Students were put into management to learn how to be management, and the whole thing was run way above board. It was not the kind of place that you were going to, quote unquote, try something new. Things were checked, double-checked, verified, and if there were any problems, you were going to get into trouble very, very quickly. It was for the students who were already either junior or senior year at Emerson, having spent a couple years learning how to be on the air. Both of these stations were located at Emerson at a time when it wasn't in its own building like it is in the present day. It was in a converted townhouse that had all sorts of departments and interrelated locations, and the townhouse, which at some point must have been unbelievably luxurious and beautiful, was still impressive architecturally, but had been taken over like by locusts for the use of everything from radio to television to library and so on. And so it had a pretty beat down quality, but not at the WERS studios. Those were carpeted, polished, taken care of. You walked in there and you knew you were on stage. WERS was professional and very, very exclusive. You auditioned to get on, and if you were lucky, you might get on. You were doing it as a requirement for your degree in radio broadcasting, and it was a stepping stone to even greater radio positions in the future. WECB, however, was a room. It was actually a room and a half. It was something that you could get on if you applied for it. At the beginning of the school year, there would be a sign-up sheet, and it had a 3-hour shift that could have a theme, but it didn't have to. People could do free-form radio, they could do punk, they could do whatever they wanted to. It was a lot of freedom, but it also meant that you had a tiny audience. The amount of people who could go upstream through the static inside of the dorms to listen to it, your potential audience was probably never going to go above the single or double digits. Usually, if anybody was listening to you, it was somebody who knew you, or was somebody who you were talking about, or they needed a radio playing in the room to ensure that nobody heard what they were actually doing. So I was very excited by the medium of radio. When I was much younger, in elementary school, we were taken on a tour of a radio station. So this had to be around 1980, 1981. And if you didn't know how radio stations worked, It was a mind-blowing experience. You walked in there and you would listen to a radio station, and I don't know what pictures you put in your head, but I had these images of warehouses of records and the DJ being in some luxurious space, but it was all incredibly utilitarian, but filled with this weird technology to make sure the voices were sweeter and that the broadcast sounded as good as it could. I remember looking at the turntable in this station with absolute wonder because it could go from 14 RPM all the way up to some other speed I'd never, ever interact with. The fact that it had this settings for worlds now gone just fascinated me. The fact that the DJ was older, he had glasses and a graying beard, but once his voice turned on for the air, it sounded like somebody who was 20 years old excitedly telling you about the greatest music coming down the pike. It really, really changed my thoughts about what you could do. The other students at the time, I mean, these are all kids who were in elementary school, they wanted to go on to the next thing, but I didn't want to leave. I think they actually had to retrieve me out of one of the record libraries because I went running around trying to understand how this all worked. So I signed up for the AM station as soon as you could. During the first week of college, there would be a sign-up sheet, and there were 3-hour shifts going 24 hours. So you could get a shift from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. or from midnight to 3 a.m. I signed up for my own shift and gave it a free-form name, and I was excited to be a part of it. I felt like I was the luckiest guy in the world when I had that gig. Imagine yourself inside of a closet, really. Think of a closet, maybe closet and a half, and that was the size of the studio. It looked out over nothing. There was a window for the studio, but it went into an even smaller room that had a few chairs that people could sit in, usually waiting for their shift to begin. The studio was bare bones. It was a few posters to explain to you who to call. It had the schedule up so you could find people, but that was about it. It was really about sitting in the small room in front of the console and sitting with the tapes. The tapes, to me, are the most engaging memory I have. It's all gone now because of the world of digital, but it used to be that there were these things called carts. In radio, you would record whatever music you had onto a 2 or 3 minute cart. It would look just like an 8-track player, and the player itself was as bare bones as you could imagine, just a square with a red light and a yellow light and a green light. And you would put a cart into this machine, and it would light up red. And then when you needed to play it, you would press the green button, and it would play through the music and then automatically stop when it got to the end. Because of the design, it would actually automatically start out at the beginning again. So this enabled other DJs to just plug the card in and have it all work. If things weren't quite synced up, you could plug it in, but it was a sin not to leave things proper for the next person. The carts themselves would have little stickers on them indicating that they were to be played in heavy rotation or that they would have some sort of important message beforehand. There were a number of public service announcements on these carts. The usual: don't drink and drive, be a good student, avoid drugs, the school is offering something. You'd have your stack of PSAs, your stack of interstitials, your stack of radio identification, and then up on a rack, all of the different songs that you could play in rotation. The way that this particular radio station worked is that it had records that were considered to be the records. You know, they would be REM or The Clash or U2, the stuff that college students were supposed to hear. I don't quite know how that selection worked deep down in the mechanism, but you could also make the show just about your stuff. There was no limit against that. So some people brought in their personal record collections, others would just talk. It all depended on what kind of show you wanted, but it did depend on people being consistently there. That's where we run into the problem. These were freshman students. They would commit themselves to a whole bunch of extracurricular activities and then discover they had way overreached. So they might try to join a comedy troupe or get involved in a play or do radio or work for the newspaper. And then at some point they would realize, oh, I have classes. I have homework. How am I going to do a 9 p.m. to 12 p.m. show on Tuesday when I have a whole project due tomorrow? So over the course of a semester, people would leaf off. Folks would not be able to get in. They'd call in. They'd say, I'm not going to make it. Could you cover my shift? And as time went on, that would get worse and worse and worse. I remember that I was doing one of my shows, and the next DJ called in and told me, yeah, look, I'm not going to make it. I'm just not feeling well. He had come down with the homework flu and wasn't going to make it. So I did his shift. 3 more hours. And then towards the end of that shift, the next DJ called. Suddenly I had done 9 hours. So once we got to 18 hours, I was pretty messed up. I wandered out of there and I could barely function. But when you're 19 years old, you can throw your body through a bunch of things. So I thought that I was having a good time, and I thought that it was a really good thing for me, and I loved the training, the being able to speak under pressure, the coming up with new things to say about the same old carts, and trying to do the shows in such a way that my imagined audience would feel like I was there with them, so that when my audiences became real, I'd be ready for them. But there was one aspect about WECB that didn't sit right with me. There was a manager of this station, just a student manager. After you were there for a couple years, you could be a manager or an assistant manager. And it just meant that you were on call and you could make music choices. And he did. And they had a record library, but he had the key. The record library could only be accessed by the manager. Inside, at most 1,000 records, barely something to fill an iPod now, but he had total dictatorial control over what in there could be played on the air. And occasionally, during the day, the record library would be open, probably because somebody was working on it, and I'd go in there and I wouldn't be able to understand at all what the records meant. It was like they were put in there randomly. It wasn't by alphabet, it wasn't by year, it wasn't by genre even. It was just a whole series of randomized records from some system I couldn't understand, and again, not really allowed to play from it. I thought this was terrible. You know that I love sorting, cataloging, and making things easier to find. One might say I've defined my whole life around it. I made a choice, and that choice got me fired from WECB. One night actually, I sorted the record library, went in there, totally took every record out of every shelf, and put it all back together. Used a series of colored index cards to indicate the artist's name or the years, put in a whole bunch of extra information on other cards and taped them up, basically made it that anybody could walk in, understand what they were looking at, and find what was needed to be found. Do you want to play more REM? Maybe those deep cuts? Well, just go to the REM section. There they all are. Do you want to play something from rock? Well, there was a rock section. There was a jazz section, tiny as it was. An alternative section. It was sorted to be useful for everyone. And what happened, of course, was a call came to me from the manager, and he asked to see me in his tiny, weird little office. And he explained to me that was not acceptable. And I asked him, well, it seemed like the system was only understood by one person. And he said, it was me. And that's how I got fired from WECB. So one of my friends from the first days that I was at Emerson was a lady named Kelly Rafuse. She had come from Vermont, and at Vermont, in her teens, she had done on-air DJing. This meant that she was already a seasoned performer when she stepped into Emerson. She didn't need a whole lot of training. She got some of the theory and she learned some more of the terms, but in point of fact, she was ready to go. She probably could have walked out of there and gotten a job at pretty much any station. I would hear her switch from her regular voice into her radio voice, and it was like magic for me. I thought she was the greatest thing. And she got a job at WERS in her freshman year, something almost unprecedented, certainly incredibly rare. So as we knew each other, she was working at WERS as a DJ. There were a bunch of shows at WERS that were there for years, one for Broadway musicals, one for reggae. In fact, WERS was one of the main stations to listen to reggae during the day. And so if you were new, you were assigned to a show. So you'd come in all ready to go, and they would say, guess what? You are doing reggae. And that was your lot because you were learning at the full professional FCC-watched radio station. Over time, slots were available to create your own show, and Kelly proposed and got a show of her own. The show was called Alternative Parameters, and what she did was put out a call for bands that were unsigned in the Boston area to send in their tapes, and she would play them on the air. This sounds like the most basic, simple idea, but it's not something many radio stations did. Even by 1989, it was such a, in many ways, corporatized environment that if you were a band that was trying to break out, the idea that someone would just play some music off your tape caused them to start sending in all sorts of music. And these were bands that were odd or based on noise, and Kelly did her best to curate some of the finest work of unsigned bands. I'm sure if you listen to recordings of Alternative Parameters, you would hear bands that went on to great things, and she may have been their first radio play. Well, if you had a show, you could ask someone to be your alternate, and the alternate would be there if you were sick and otherwise not available. And it was at such an odd time at the station, in fact, it would close the shift, that Kelly asked me to be the alternative of Alternative Parameters, and I took that leap. So for a short time, for a couple shows, I was a DJ on regular FM radio in the Boston area. I don't know how many people heard me. I'm sure I sounded really weird. I said some pretty crazy stuff, nothing untoward or otherwise unacceptable, but I was a voice on radio, and I love the idea that somebody was just driving along late at night, maybe coming in from a road trip or heading out to somewhere, and turning on the radio and for a moment hearing me. I mean, it's such a powerful feeling. And we did that show together for at least a year, and it was a success of its own. She had a really good idea and executed on it, to me, basically perfectly. These bands, they got their shot. We got to play music that wasn't just given to us by some faceless company or dictated by some manager. And the audience learned about bands they would have never heard about, a level of discovery that we didn't see again until the net. See, college radio, especially by the late 80s and early 90s, it's kind of just another corporate outlet. It's something that is a genre, college radio. Now, I know that other colleges had different character. You would have an FM station that was truly run by the students, not for some lab, not because it was a major at the school, but because they literally had it as a student voice. And while a lot of this function was removed by the web, at the time, it was a place for the student voice to be heard, for students to talk about what was important to them, to create news stories to give to the other students, to do some level of organizing, or to play music or bands that were local that they thought would engage with their contemporaries. It was a very, very different world, and I'm really happy that the Internet Archive has as many hours of recordings of those times, because they really are, in many ways, absolutely gone. If you want to hear just literally thousands of hours of different kinds of radio stations and how they played, the collection at the Internet Archive is called Air Checks. Just look for Air Checks and you'll find all sorts of records, general recordings of people being goofy on the air or playing interesting types of tracks and just having a character. Yeah, a character we just don't see anymore when things are all pre-recorded in central locations and made to sound like they're local when they really, really aren't. I loved my time at WERS. There was one event that they did every year, a fundraiser, because WERS took a lot of its funding from public donation as well as what the school was giving. And it was this live music week. And what would happen is that bands, one after another, would set up all over the week and do these 1-hour live performances. I mean, literally set the band up and start rocking out in the studio live. And in between each of the songs, let you know where to call to get to people. I worked on the fundraising phones on a couple occasions and then went into the studios because nobody cared. I was a student. And there were bands I could see live that I'd never ever get a chance to see live, and it was just me and them and maybe one or two other students standing around having a live performance right there. I treasure that time. And since then, I've been on the radio, but only as someone who gets interviewed. I've made a number of appearances on Off the Hook with Emmanuel Goldstein and crew. I've been on a bunch of podcasts, and I've been on some actual AM and FM terrestrial stations that allowed me to come in, do an interview, be a part of the show, and then move on. And I have to credit my comfort with the microphone to those early years at Emerson College. And remember, that wasn't even my major. It was just something I wanted to do. And, it never hurts to try something new. Try it. Try it. At worst, you smile to everyone, say, I don't think this is going to work for me, and move on. I hope you've got a few in your back pocket that maybe you'll act on. So, there's one minor detail I didn't mention about getting fired from WECB, and that's how I got into the record library to sort it. So let's do that. It helps to understand how the buildings looked. There's kind of a visual aspect to this. The door was completely locked. There was no chance of me getting in through that door. I wasn't a lock picker, and I certainly wasn't going to knock it down. So I had to come up with another plan. This plan was terrible, but I did do it. Think of a regular building that has 3 or 4 floors, and each floor has 2 or 3 windows. Now, imagine that every floor has 2 bay windows, okay? And I figured out that people tended not to lock the windows when they weren't the first floor. I opened up the window of the bay window next to the record library and then got out on the windowsill, then crawled along a ledge to the other bay window that had the records. Then I sat in there for something like 5 or 6 hours and sorted all of the records, brought them all out, made piles, figured it all out, and then put them back in along with index cards that I had brought and made it as clear as day what everything was. Then I went out the window. Then it was just a matter of going out through the unlockable door from the inside and then locking it as I went out. This would all be weird enough, except I need you to understand that this was all on the 4th floor. There was no net, there was nothing but concrete below me, and it was all because I really, really, really needed to sort these records. This is Jason Scott, talks his way out of it. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Mark Pilgrim, Sam Johnston, and Adam Green, along with the hundreds of other supporters who have been helping me get out of debt. So the tax bill came in. I owe about $450 to New York State, and I owe about $6,500 to the federal government for 2017. A lot of that comes from a check that I got from the group whose check I didn't properly list in 2012. And of course, this time I was sure to make sure that it was also listed and taxed. And as a result, it shot up my taxes for 2017. And of course, the additional podcast money, which has been used to pay those previous taxes and not the taxes I was going to owe on the money itself. You know, in the old days, a $6,500 bill would flatten and floor me and send me into a spiral of sadness. Now, to me, it's just the price of being lucky. It's going to be ripples of taxes for a few years because of all this, but as a result, there are no other extant debts. I don't owe doctors anything. It's just being a straightforward, tax-paying citizen doing what they need to, and living without fear or regret or worry. Thanks again for that.